it's often said that the book is always better. I mean, Dave, do you think that's always true? Do you think there are adaptations that are superior to the source novel?
I think it's surprise. I think that is very, very much a common perception, as you say. And I think when you do think of the book's, a novel, a book's ability to go so deep into character psyche, for example, and scene description, it can be a much more vivid experience, but they are different mediums. And I think if people really sat down and I think realized how many great films are adapted from source novels, I think they'd be surprised how many great films there are and exist on their own merits. So I suppose when you're saying better, we shouldn't always mean personal taste. Perhaps it can be a more objective thing in that, does the film have equal cultural merit? For example, Michael Radford's film version of 1984 is a very good adaptation of George Orwell's novel, and it's a good film, but it just can't tap into that pervasive horror of the novel, in my opinion, not to the same depths, but I think also culturally it doesn't capture the truly despairing aspect of that book. I think of when Winston Smith is debating whether O'Brien is his friend or if he's his enemy, and the emotional conflict he goes through. Although the film does present it very aptly, it's you just simply don't get that maddening toing and froing that's going on in Winston's mind. So perhaps you can't, from an objective perspective, you're lacking that intricacy that a novel can offer. But I think screen adaptations of books can give you depth by really utilizing cinema language. I mean, for example, Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club is both a terrific book and a seminal film, so it's succeeded culturally in both aspects. Both capture the mood of the times, and that they still have something to say about masculinity, materialism, isolation. Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, it's a brilliant and exacting and chilling novel, quite a hard read, really. It's maybe not as accessible as Mary Harron's film, which does bring out the black humour more, and it shows how set pieces on screen can provide all the detail you need without resorting to the repetition that the novel uses to convey this very detached mind, which is very effective, but it becomes very hard to not to engage with, but it becomes hard to enjoy. Whereas I think the film, you could argue it's maybe more sanitized, and maybe that is a good argument for the book being perfect in what it's setting out to do, and you can't improve on that. But on the flip side, we do get the message that the super rich, the privileged, and the wealthy are untouchable in society, and both do that very well, but come at it from different angles. And yes, sort of a more recent example would be Martin Amis's A Zone of Interest, which I read the book after seeing Jonathan Glazer's film version. And I'm a big fan of Jonathan Glazer. I think he's very much going to that example of using pure cinema language to bring out the themes of a novel. It's a story told visually and orally, whereas Zone of Interest does play more as a straightforward story. So I think that's a really good example of how film can utilize the power of pure visual language by creating suggestion that provides meaning and immersion.
I think a key thing to remember that people do forget is that films and books are different mediums. Yes, there are similarities, but there are major differences as well. People sometimes say that The Shining is a good adaptation, a good film, but a bad adaptation. And I think that that's too easy. The Shining is a very interesting book. It's a very interesting film. Obviously, Stephen King famously didn't like it, although I think there's a bit of mythology around that. I think he admires elements of it. He even acknowledged how the film had kept the book in the public consciousness when he wrote Dr. Sleep. But it's understanding that the two are very different. And when I think of films that are maybe better than books, I think of the Red Dragon series, in which I think that Red Dragon is the best book of that series, whereas Silence of the Lambs, I personally feel is the better film. And I do feel with something like Silence of the Lambs, just on a sort of practical level, at the end of the book, Hannibal Lecter writes a letter to Clarice, and at the end of the film, he calls her on the phone, and that's just a bit more chilling, and it's just a bit more visual. And the narrative perspectives as well, they can often shift. If you think of films like Room or To Kill a Mockingbird, they're told very much from one person's point of view. Films, on the other hand, it's hard to do that. Not impossible, but unless you use things like voiceover, that can be quite difficult, and sometimes you don't understand that you're necessarily seeing something just from this one character's perspective. I mean, you, Tim, you're the writer. What do you think are the sort of connections between films and books, and what do you think are the key differences?
I agree with what you said, that they are totally different media, and they're different versions and different takes on the same story. So I think when you read a book, you're making your own film of it. I think every reader reads a book in a different way and makes their own version of the movie in their head. And often, if you go back and reread a book, you read it in a different way as well, and you make a different movie. You remake it. Interestingly,
you imagine the characters as they look, don't you?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Especially if you read a book after you've seen the film, I think that's a very different experience, because if I saw The Shining before I read the book, then reading it, Jack Torrance would be Jack Nicholson straight away, obviously, because everything's presented to you in a film. It's more of I hate to say passive experience, but there's not so much audience interaction when you're watching a film as when you're reading the book, I don't think. You mentioned, Phil, voiceover. That's one way you can get sort of interiority into a movie from a book. Like, I'm thinking Blade Runner or something like that. But also, I think dream sequences, which sometimes can feel like a cheat, but also it's another way of getting inside characters' heads in a movie. Interestingly, Dave, you mentioned American Psycho. I'm pretty sure I read this being remade somewhere, which
No.
just
God, I hope
I
not.
find a bit weird. It'll probably be a
Yeah.
TV series.
Yeah, they never learn.
Films better than books. As a novelist, I tend to think there aren't that many, but I always go for Jaws, because I think it's one of the best films ever made still nowadays. It's a long time since I read the book. I just remember the book feeling more like a sort of a family drama novel with a shark, whereas Jaws is, it's a massive character piece, and the shark's just another character on the boat, on the orca. Jaws is still, and there's even something like Shawshank, that Stephen King's one of my favorite writers, and Rita Hayworth in Shawshank Redemption is a great novella. The movie, I think, surpasses it, and the movie's one of those rare instances where it transcends the source material. I've never read The Godfather, so I don't know how good the novel is, but it wouldn't surprise me if the movie's something that sort of transcends.
I know people who've read Mario Puzo's novel, and they say it's really it's really just more or less Pulp Fiction, this big mafia
Right.
family sort of drama, but Coppola's turned it into something more operatic and stately. So it'd
Yeah,
be interesting
absolutely.
to
Yeah.
read and see if that was the impression I took away. As you say, it'd be quite
Yeah.
fascinating to see how Coppola's gone about that.